Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Perlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about Christopher Columbus and the exploration of the Western world in the 15th and 16th centuries with my guest, Matthew Restall. He is the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of History and Anthropology and Director of Latin American Studies at Penn State University. He has authored over 30 books, including 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, When Montezuma Met Cortes, and his latest book, The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Your book is a fascinating read, detailed for the scholar, but also for those of us who want to know more about what you call Columbiana. Did I say that right?
I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I kind of made it up, right? So I guess that's as good a pronunciation as any. This was, I would say Columbiana, but that sounds very English. You say it better.
It's really about the multiple stories that you discuss in your book, from where Columbus was born and why over 12 places claim his birthplace, how he traveled the world, what his life was really like. Let's begin with the concept that he was trying to go to Asia, because I really got the sense in reading your book that he was a merchant marine trying to go and collect goods and ended up in the Caribbean, and that he wasn't trying to prove the Earth was round because that was sort of already decided. Could you explain what made him travel the globe by ship?
Yeah, you've nailed it right there. He was a merchant mariner, and that's really important for us to remember. It's easy to imagine that his motivations were religious, that his head is all in that kind of world, or that he's all about some kind of fantastic vision of discovery for discovery's sake. And actually, he had his feet very firmly planted on the ground, which sounds like a funny thing to say, considering how much of his life he actually spent at sea. But that's very kind of a mundane terrestrial motivations that he had, which is, as you said, to find a more direct way to access East Asia for trading purposes, and secondarily, therefore, perhaps the possibility of establishing some kind of territorial foothold for the King and Queen of Spain, his sponsors, that would result in some colonies, some converting of indigenous peoples or Asian peoples, and so on. But primarily, it is about trade, and it's about finding a trade route that no one else has found before.
When Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, did he know that the Earth was round, or did he still believe that the Earth was flat?
That is a great question. It's amazing how many people still think that Columbus was a genius because he knew the world was round and everyone else thought it was flat. In fact, everybody knew the world was round in his time.
Each chapter deals with another aspect of his life, and you call those his 9 lives. What are they?
The lives, this is a particular way in which I've sort of cut the cake, right? Or made 9 pizza slices, if you like. And the first 2 are his historic life. That's his actual life from his birth to death. And then the 3rd life is the story of what happens to his bones and his legacy. And the 4th and 5th lives deal with other aspects of his afterlife. And one's called the Saint, and the other one's called the Lover. I think those are self-explanatory. The 6th and 7th lives deal with all the claims that he was actually not from Genoa, but from a particular part of Iberia or somewhere else in Europe. And those I've organized into, the first of those is all about the Iberian claims, and then the other one is other parts of the world. And then the last 2 lives, 8 and 9, take us to the United States and are really rooted mostly in the 19th century and explain how an American Columbus and then an Italian-American Columbus, that they were created in the 19th century and still are very much alive today.
I thought it was interesting that people think he, quote, discovered the New World. That's what our mythology is all about in our history classes in the United States. But of course, we know the Viking Vikings settled in North America centuries before. He never stepped foot on what is now the United States. He landed in the Caribbean islands and took back indigenous people as slaves. He wasn't really a very kind person in that regard. There's a lot of accusations that he committed genocide. What is the story there about where he actually came from Europe to North America?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in there in your question. If I could just briefly say something about some of these details. There's an enormous amount written about and an enormous amount of argumentation going back centuries over little details like what point he actually first landed on, where in the Caribbean he first set foot, so exactly where he discovered when he discovered America, and then the argumentation over was he really the first? Who really was the first? Who was the first discoverer? And so on. And part of what I wanted to convey in my book is I don't say it doesn't matter in the book, right? But in our conversation I can say, look, it doesn't matter. That's not really the point. Did the Vikings get to North America 500 years before? Yes, they did. Technically they did. Newfoundland is where there was a small Viking colony, so they were there first. Indigenous peoples kind of got there first too. Let's go back tens of thousands of years. They came over from Northeast Asia. So if you're talking about human beings first setting foot in the Americas, it was those Asians that then evolved over tens of thousands of years into indigenous Americans. And we can even kind of chip away at this subject even more and suggest that it's possible that, say, Bristol fishermen, so fishermen from the English port town of Bristol, were crossing the North Atlantic further and further to access shoals of cod and other fish, and they almost certainly saw coastlines that are part of North America, and it's possible that some had set foot on there. But it doesn't really matter in the sense that it's all about what happens afterwards. So after, in the wake of Columbus's first voyage, after his early voyages, there is then a wave of Europeans bringing Africans with them, mostly enslaved, and then returning with indigenous peoples, again, mostly enslaved. So there's an entire movement of peoples that comes after Columbus, and that's what really matters. That's what changes the world. And also, I think, to kind of let me sort of move, not so gently perhaps, into the second part of your question, you threw out there some provocative buzzwords, right?
Absolutely.
Slavery, genocide, and so on. And you probably won't be surprised to know that the word genocide is associated with Columbus is relatively recent. That the word is less than 100 years old in the English language. But it wasn't associated with him until really the lead up to the quincentennial. So it's the kind of thing that's being said beginning in the 1980s as we approach that quincentennial, and it becomes apparent that that quincentennial is going to be conflictual, it's going to be controversial, it's not going to be the same as the quadricentennial in 1892, which was a massive celebration of Columbus and everything that comes after him. It was a huge celebration of the world in 1892 without anybody wringing their hands and being upset about what happens to indigenous peoples and African peoples. It was a big celebration of Western civilization and the impact that it had had, seen then as entirely positive on the Americas. We get to 1892, that's very different. That throwing words like genocide at Columbus, I would argue it's a discussion point, right? I don't want to take a position saying, look, this is ridiculous, he did not commit or never intended to commit nor ever did commit genocide. And I also don't want to say, look, the indigenous population collapsed by as much as 90% in the 100 years after his first voyage, and that's all his fault. I don't want to say either of those two things, not because I want to be a wishy-washy historian that takes a kind of a middle ground. You know those historians that everything is kind of a maybe and a perhaps. It's not so much that, it's that I want people to understand that Columbus does not make his voyages in a vacuum. He's not alone. He has with him hundreds and then later thousands of people, and as soon as that first voyage happens, other people start making those crossings. You look at a typical maps that accompany Columbus books and they show an empty Atlantic Ocean with little dotted lines showing his 4 voyages, which give the impression, and this was an impression I had as a child, actually even way into adulthood from those maps, the impression that he is alone. I don't mean he's on a little rowboat all on his own. I mean his little voyages, first of all just 3 ships and then 2 come back and then a few more. It gives the impression, the idea that the Atlantic Ocean is completely empty of human inhabitants and travelers. Once we get past 1492, 1493, there are thousands of people sailing back and forth across the ocean Ocean. And not only that, but we have to remember that Europeans, particularly Iberians, have already got halfway there because they have been slowly exploring the Atlantic Ocean for a couple of hundred years, finding islands, fighting over them. The Portuguese and the Castilians are fighting over the Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores, and then establishing colonies on these islands. And that takes them halfway from Iberia to the Americas. This idea that Columbus, with his brilliant visionary, setting out across this huge ocean is extremely misleading. And as soon as we start to appreciate the larger context, that then changes how we see these thorny issues to do with slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples.
You certainly detailed the exploration and explained that we are really suffering under a myth of what occurred. Your documentation is so thorough because you spent over 30 years doing research, only maybe 2 years to write the book, but it took a lot of time to do the research, and you read original documents in the original languages, many different languages that most people have never heard about.
It sounds very impressive, but honestly, if I was able to speak a dozen languages, and there are people who can do that, and I'm always incredibly impressed and amazed by that. I can't do that. I didn't learn all of these languages to be able to speak them, to understand even when somebody talks to me in those languages. That's really impressive. I mean, just take a random language that's an important one for the book, Gallego, from the Spanish province of Galicia or Galicia. So I can read books in that language, and I had to because I wanted to understand the Gallego position on Columbus, which is that people in Galicia believe that Columbus was from that Spanish province, that he was not from Genoa. And that's a story that I tell at the beginning of the book, and it was kind of the seed of the book.
Yes, because everybody seems to want to claim where he was from. You certainly made the case that he was from what we now call Italy, but at that time it wasn't even Italy.
No, in political terms, Italy is not going to exist for 400 years after Columbus. So Genoa was a nation state, had its own little trading empire in the Mediterranean, and he was quite clearly from Genoa. But I discovered when I was visiting friends in Galicia a few years ago that people in that province believed that he was from there, that he was actually a Gallego nobleman who in 1492 seemed to die, but in fact survived, changed his name to Christopher Columbus, or in Spanish would be Cristóbal Colón, and then he crossed the ocean and discovered America. And this just absolutely stunned me when I learned this from my friends, and they said, oh yes, well, there's a castle nearby, which is his castle, you can go visit it. This is where he lived, and they took me there, and sure enough, there's information there for visitors. The castle has kind of been restored and is open to visitors, and there's the information explaining that he was really Christopher Columbus. And I just was so amazed. It actually blew my mind so much that I had a kind of eureka moment, and it was right there, standing in the parking lot looking at that castle, that the whole idea for the book came to me, including the title, because I thought, this is a different Columbus. This is another life that Columbus lived, and he didn't really live it, because I was pretty sure that Columbus was really from Genoa. I thought, but if there's maybe tens of thousands of people who believe this, doesn't that make it something worthy of some kind of respect and investigation and so on? I thought, I wonder how many of these lives there are. So I had the idea for the book. And in that moment, I thought the 9 lives, each one was going to be a different part of the world where people believed he was from. It didn't work out that way, because as I then started doing the research, I discovered this whole world of, as we mentioned earlier, of Colombiana. And so the lives end up being broken down in different ways. And in fact, that Gallego nobleman is only one character in a chapter that is about all the Iberian claims on Columbus, which let me loop back to the question that I was answering 5 minutes ago. So I had to read books in Gallego and books in Catalan, languages that I didn't think I knew, because I certainly can't speak to them. And I visited those places in the course of research, and people would speak to me in those languages. And I'm like, I'd have to respond in Spanish. There is a big difference between learning to speak a language and being able to read it for very specific purpose, not just kind of generally reading everything in those languages, but specific works relating to this topic.
And you also read books in English, many biographies about him that made up stories about him, and those stories continue, and you discuss the term myth history, where they're taking myths and stories, making it history as though it's for real. You go through all those different kinds of interpretations of who he was, what he did, where he is from, where he died. There's even controversy over where his bones are, where his ashes are buried. We'll talk about that. There's so much incredible information in your book, The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus, and we are going to talk more about this very important person in America and elsewhere when we return in a moment with my guest, Matthew Restall.
For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Matthew Restall. He is the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of History and Anthropology and Director of Latin American Studies at Penn State University. I assume that in some of your other 30-plus books that you encountered something about Christopher Columbus, because you did talk about the Spanish conquest in North America and elsewhere. You've written many different historical works. I am wondering why you think that the United States of America has become so fascinated with this person, because you describe in one of the 9 Lives chapters how, particularly in the 1800s, there were statues and monuments and all sorts of other activities surrounding him, and even in the naming of some of our places, like the District of Columbia, and how many places we name after this person, and why there's this fascination.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, I discovered that there are more places named after Columbus in the United States than all the other countries in the world put together. How extraordinary was that? And I thought that can't be right. And I spent a lot of time kind of combing through maps of Latin America, and Wikipedia is wonderful and gets more wonderful every day, right? That people have come up with lists of place names that relate to Columbus and Colon. So some people sort of did some of that work already for me. I thought, no, there must be more. I mean, there's a whole country in Latin America named after him, right? The country of Colombia. Well, it turned out, no, that is true. We're talking about thousands of public places in the United States. And that's not even including private ones, businesses and so on. So there is a kind of really good question. And that was one of the most fascinating parts of the research for me. As a Latin American historian, I have not spent a lot of time researching and writing about U.S. history. And I've discovered that in the course of researching this book, I had to kind of put on a new hat. And that is kind of as an American historian, because that's where the story goes. As you said, not to kind of give too much away, because we want people to be so intrigued they buy the book, right?
I hope they do read the book, because it is so incredible how you have weaved together all the different information from so many different kinds of sources to give us a clearer picture of this man and the explorations of the world and the complications of a person's life. You explained how he was really very desirous of power and titles. He got the title Admiral of the Sea, and even his descendants to this day, I think there's the 20th Admiral of the Sea, but the descendants have been fighting over his legacy and have had lawsuits against Spain for centuries. Explain what's going on with this kind of situation, that his life is still in the present.
Yeah, his life is still in the present. There are Columbuses today in so many ways, right? So we were just talking about in the United States, if you're curious as a listener and a potential reader about Columbus statues and why people are fighting over them and so on, that was something that I kind of uncovered, and I got to the point where it made sense to me, so I was able to explain, and that's in Lives 8 and 9, these two different Columbuses, what I call the American Columbus and the Italian-American Columbus, and they're still very much alive today. I mean, there's been statements issued from the White House this year about bringing Christopher back and how important he is to American history and to Italian Americans. Those are two separate Columbuses, and they tend to get very muddled up, and I hope in the book I clarified how they are overlapping, but they are separate Columbuses, and both of them come out of 19th century American history. But in the meantime, as you say, there's a Columbus legacy that lives on in Spain. Members of the Columbus family are fighting each other in the law courts for hundreds of years over that legacy, meaning the titles and the income and the wealth that comes with those titles, and also with the Spanish government, because according to Columbus's original agreement agreement with the crown, he's to receive a stipend, a kind of a pension, if you like, that's supposed to go to his heirs, and they're fighting over that. That is originally equivalent to millions of dollars a year in Columbus's lifetime. And it slowly gets smaller and smaller, but has a kind of a symbolic value, and is still being paid in the 20th century. I think it's still being paid today. I was not able to find out that for sure, or a specific sum of money, but the fact that it's still being paid all the way into the modern era is a pretty astonishing thing, I think. That was a discovery for me, and so I like to think that readers are also kind of discovering that fact as well, along with me as they read the book.
With the extensive research that you did, I am sure that you made many new discoveries that you hadn't expected. What was the most surprising?
Oh, I made many. I should say a lot of these discoveries are things that I found in other books. So the value of the book, it isn't the 100 things that I've discovered that no one has ever discovered before, but there's, say, 100 things that you can find buried in this book and that book, and sometimes these are books from 100 years ago or more. They're not all books in English where somebody has figured something out. And what I've tried to do here is kind of put all of those things together while also spending a little time investigating whether they are true or not. So I don't even know where to begin with what was the most amazing. I mean, I think what we were just talking about the bones and the legacy and so on, that was really amazing to me. That I knew that the Spaniards claimed that he was buried in the cathedral in Seville, and I knew that there was a big tomb in the Dominican Republic in the city of Santo Domingo that was built in the 1980s and is supposed to house his bones there. So I knew there was a conflict. But what I didn't know was the history of those bones as they supposedly went back and forth across the ocean. This is a story that goes from right after he died all the way up until about 120 years ago, and people are still arguing and fighting over it now, I guess, with that tomb built in the 1980s and the tomb in Seville recently opened and DNA tests done on those bones so that some interested parties in Spain can prove, they're claiming that they've proven not only that that's Christopher Columbus, but that he's a Spaniard and that he was Jewish. So now there's a controversy over his bones that's taken into the 2020s and surely all the way through the 21st century surrounding his bones. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Did I discover all of that? No, but good luck finding anywhere written in English where all of that story is told, including somebody who's bothered, as I did, I couldn't resist, it's so much fun, reading the controversies and arguments and so on in the 1870s and 1880s in Spanish and Italian over what these bones were. Let me give you one little detail. There's an Italian priest in Santo Domingo in the cathedral who scrapes some of the dust up off the floor of the cathedral that supposedly falls out of the urn when they open up the urn that supposedly has Columbus's bones in. That dust is now in a small urn in Genoa in a museum identified as being the ashes of Christopher Columbus. It's just so fascinating, all of these little bits and pieces, and I think when you put them all together, there is a story that does kind of make sense and helps us to understand everything that happened.
As I discuss your book with others and how you have convinced me of your position of who he was and what he did and what he accomplished and why there's so many myths about him and so many misunderstandings about what he accomplished, I get people's reaction like, what? What is your reaction from your students and your colleagues?
The first thing people say is, particularly academics, right? Fellow historians and graduate students and so on, they say, why? Why are you writing about Columbus? They say, is there anything new to say about Columbus? And then they say, and also, isn't that so controversial? Aren't you just stepping into a minefield? Why would you do that? And I understand that question because that's why I haven't written about Columbus before. I got my degree, my PhD in 1992, the year of the quincentennial. Columbus has been somebody that's been impossible to ignore for me in a lot of my writing, but particularly in the classroom throughout my teaching career. And I totally understand that question. If you had asked me or said to me 10 years ago, how about writing a book on Columbus? I would have said, no, absolutely no way. There's just trouble there. So it's really a sort of a question of finding an angle or being inspired, right? And that was what happened to me, was that kind of moment I described earlier in Galicia. The eureka moment was the moment of inspiration. And then I realized, oh, there is a story here, but the story is not just to tell the biography of Columbus as a historic person himself. That's not the story. That's, of course, in the book, and anyone who doesn't really know much about or thinks they know very little about historic Columbus will find his life story laid out there. But the story is really about about Columbiana. It's about how Columbus is perceived and understood and misunderstood. It requires an answer.
You certainly have found a new way to discuss him. What has been the reaction of your colleagues, your students, about the new information that you have presented in your book to explore his life and his accomplishments?
Much to my delight, nobody has said to me, "Oh, I read your book and everything in it I already knew." But people have said what I kind of hoped they would say, which is, "Oh, yes, there are things in here that I did know, but a lot that I didn't." And particularly, what has been pleasing is when people say, "I like all the connections you're making. You're connecting little things or large things that I know to things that I didn't know and weaving them together to tell this kind of larger story." And that has been very gratifying. That was what I hoped to be able to achieve.
You spent years researching the lives of Christopher Columbus. How do you feel about him now?
Oh, I don't like him very much as a person, but I don't hate him. When I researched Montezuma and Cortes, for example, for another book, I grew to rather admire Montezuma and to really detest Cortes. And I found with Columbus, I sort of see him somewhere in the middle of that. I definitely would not say he's someone I admire or detest. I don't like him particularly. I think he was a bit of a bore.
You have written over 30 books, and you have focused a lot on the North American, Central American people, the Mayans and the Spanish, and the encounters between all of them in Mesoamerica. What should we know about them?
I think having an appreciation for Indigenous American history is really important, crucial to almost any topic to do with the history of the Americas. And too often, ethno-history, as scholars sometimes call it, or the history of indigenous peoples, kind of gets shunted aside and becomes kind of a footnote. If this book had been longer, I would have spent a lot more time talking about indigenous peoples. In a way, I regret that there aren't more of them in the book. But the story took me back to Europe and up to the United States in the end, so we get away from that. But it's incredibly important.
Wish we had time for you to tell us all the stories, but that's why people should read this book, The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. Over 13 pages of bibliography of books that you read, that you went through to try to get the real story. You dispelled some myths that he didn't have Jewish heritage. You dispelled the myth that he really wasn't a saint or shouldn't receive that kind of accolade. You went through the myths that have surrounded him in the last few centuries, tried to explain the real history. It's a wonderful story of not just the person, but of the period and of the exploration and of the need, as you say, to have a rigorous historical accounting, because there are over 2,000 books on Columbus and a lot of made-up history. You talk about the myth history. I certainly was fascinated every single page. He is known for supposedly sailing into the unknown, which you have indicated isn't really the case, for crossing the ocean for the first time, which really isn't the case. What is the takeaway here about this person and the belief in what the world looked like, what the world was, and how he helped make it something else?
There's a lot of confusion about Columbus. I think that there's so many things that have been said and are written that are contradictory. I think people are kind of confused, and who wants to go and read a whole bunch of books to kind of solve their confusion? Nobody has time for that, right? And I hope I've kind of given people a shortcut, if you like, kind of a one-stop shop that answers all the questions you've got and answers questions you never even realized that you'd never considered or never even realized were out there. I think also that confusion lies in the people quite understandably think of Columbus as a single person. He was, historically speaking, one individual. And by seeing him as multiple manifestations, as many Columbuses, as all of these lives, and of course 9 lives, I picked that particular number, it works for making the argument thing. The point is there's multiple Columbuses. And once you appreciate that, I think that resolves a lot of the confusion. Columbus is also a battleground. People are fighting over Columbus. There's demonstrations and a lot of anger, and every year there are statues pulled down and red paint thrown on paintings and statues in museums on both sides of the Atlantic. People get very upset. And I would like to think that by better understanding these many Columbuses, that story of conflict can be flipped. And instead, Columbus can be a site for debate, discussion, mutual respect, understanding, and so on. Maybe that's a little kind of naive and bleeding heart of me, but that would be my hope. hope.
You certainly have accomplished that. I'm talking to people all the time about your book and about this person and what the stories really are, the real stories, the myths. It's definitely led to some wonderful conversations. I want to thank you so very much for presenting the real story of what happened and who Christopher Columbus was. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me on the show, Nancy. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. I have been speaking with Matthew Restall, who is the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of History and Anthropology and Director of Latin American Studies at Penn State University, and author of his latest book, The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.